Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Let's Talk virtual chat with Brian Platt. We are going to give folks just a couple of minutes to get started. We've got folks still entering the waiting room, and I'm going to let them in a little bit at a time. I think we're just about ready to get started. We've got everybody in. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Liz Harris. I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator at BikeWalkKC. My pronouns are she and her. We're happy to have you. BikeWalkKC is doing these, we've been doing these Let's Talk events because the pandemic is accelerating many trends and big changes throughout the region. And our Let's Talk series is a conversation with leaders in Kansas City to find out how that acceleration is happening locally for the transportation, health, equity, and sustainability issues that are core to our mission, as well as the intersectional issues that often overlap with our work. So things like racism, housing, economic development, and more. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to Michael Kelley, who is our Policy and Advocacy Director here at BikeWalkKC, and he's going to go ahead and take it away. All yours, Michael.
Righty. Thank you very much, Liz. And again, for everyone who is here, thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Kelley, and as Liz said, I'm the Policy Director here at BikeWalkKC. Pronouns are he, him, his. And we are very fortunate today to have our guest speaker, Mr. Brian Platt from the city. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course, happy to be here.
So before we start getting into the questions with Brian, I did want to read a little bit of his bio and background for the audience. Brian started as the new city manager in December, and since he has started in Kansas City, he has developed new programs and policies with an eye for innovative use of existing resources. The city now has a more aggressive snow removal plan and a new equity plan to create a culture of inclusion while reducing discrimination. He has tackled homelessness by opening the region's largest emergency warming center. He has also recommended a balanced budget for the next fiscal year that prevents layoffs, furloughs, and any reductions in essential city services. His targeted initiatives will create a more efficient and fiscally prudent city government while maintaining, even increasing funding for certain critical infrastructure and services. Brian previously served as city manager for Jersey City, New Jersey, and he has served as the city's chief innovation officer, established in that office in 2015. His previous work experience includes management consulting with McKinsey & Company and serving as a kindergarten teacher with Teach for America. He earned his MPA degree from Columbia University and a Bachelor of Arts in philosophy at Emory. So again, Brian, we are very excited to have you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into some questions. So the first kind of portion of our discussion today, we wanted to take a little bit of time to kind of put things in proper context and kind of look back on your time in Jersey City. So tell us a little bit about Jersey City, and in your opinion, what are some of the most obvious similarities between Jersey City and Kansas City?
That's a great question, and there are certainly a lot of similarities between any and all cities in the United States, at least. When you look at any city, the list of priorities is generally similar: homelessness, crime, pedestrian safety. You're looking at the same list of things. The differentiating factors are typically the context of that city. So Vision Zero, for example, in Jersey City looks different than it does here in Kansas City. So the benefit there is that you can come from any city and slot in and say, okay, I sort of have a general idea of how to solve some of these problems. Personally, I have gone through a lot of the challenges that Kansas City is facing and made some significant progress resolving those issues in Jersey City. So I've actually had multiple instances where I've come with a document, an executive order, an ordinance, a plan, and presented it to the team here. And it's largely something that could fit in here with some minor changes based on state laws or procedure, that sort of thing. So it's been really exciting in that sense. The differences, I'd say, Well, I'd say the people here are much nicer and much more friendly than New Jersey. Go figure. But Jersey City is a much more urban area. The population density is one of the highest in the country in that region in particular. I think so I'll give you some numbers as a perspective. The population of Jersey City is around 270,000, 280,000, somewhere in that range. Kansas City, almost double. But Jersey City is only 18 square miles. Kansas City, 318 square miles. So a lot more land area here. And with an older, with a more dense city, the issues are compounded in many ways because the properties are squished together closer, the sidewalks are narrower. You're trying to fit a lot into a narrower street right of way, a narrower sidewalk, and you don't have the space and the flexibility to do a lot of stuff. All the more reason why transit and moving away from car dependency is really important in an urban area because there's just no space for all the cars. But also people are walking, they're biking, they're walking, they're doing a lot of it already. And so we're trying to make a safe place for those people to do those things in Jersey City. Here in Kansas City, it's a little different in that people it's very easy to drive around here comparatively, I'd say. You know, I know people here would say otherwise, but from where I'm from, the distances that I drive and the amount of time I drive, people will be really jealous in the New York City area about that. When I was doing my master's program at Columbia, I was living in Jersey City, and it was only maybe 2.5 miles I was traveling. It would take me an hour and a half on the subway, multiple trains, you know, and walking and all that stuff. It would take me 45 minutes to drive-ish. Maybe it was 3 miles. But either way, like, I mean, that's a 4-minute drive here in Kansas City for the most part, 5-minute drive. So, you know, it's different. But I think that the need here is very important and urgent for us nonetheless. It is crucial that, you know, I guess I'm sort of digressing from the question you asked, but it's really important that we're thinking about these safety mechanisms now before the city is built out in certain neighborhoods so that there's not a push and pull like I faced in Jersey City. We were fighting everywhere doing Vision Zero implementations because we had to sacrifice. There wasn't enough street width to do the things we wanted to do. Had to remove parking, we had to remove traveling, we had to remove all these things that were already sort of at max capacity. So that I think is the big difference where like the space restrictions and needs and sort of the uses of it are much different in a very dense urban area like that.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, I think that the idea about, you know, wanting to kind of move more aggressively on Vision Zero certainly resonates, and especially against the backdrop of the pandemic, where physical distancing was one of the key things that public health officials were really urging the public to engage in, and they're still urging people to do. So it's kind of building off of that. In your view, do you believe the pandemic has spurred larger conversations about how to support active transportation? And if so, what do you think has changed?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think though that the conversation is different in different areas. And I'll draw back to my experience in the New York City and Jersey City region. A lot of people were using mass transit, packing into buses, packing into subways. And during the pandemic, people were fearful of that sort of situation. And also it was just not allowed. So that pushed people to different modes of transit, to more personalized modes of transit and less dense modes of transit. And so what we saw was, in addition to people working from home and working remotely and not going into the office every day, people were moving to bikes, walking, their own personal cars, which was a challenge. It literally we went backwards on a lot of our transit initiatives because of the pandemic, although less people were driving. To give you some perspective, 270,000 people or so in Jersey City, 90,000 or so people got on what was called the PATH train. It was a subway that brought people from Jersey City and Newark into New York City. 90,000 people got on every morning to go to work in Jersey City. So you're thinking a third of the city, just about, getting on mass transit every day. And now they're not doing that for a lot of reasons. So certainly we saw, and it was the same here, increased demand for bikes and electric bikes and more walking and more personalized types of transit. We had big success with our rideshare initiative powered by Via that we started in Jersey City. And it's essentially a van that picks up multiple people along the way, and it can make multiple stops, but we limited it to a certain number of people, 2 or 3 people, I think. I think we said 1 person per row of the vehicle to spread people out. We put up barriers and that sort of stuff. Sure. That service took off in wake of buses and subways and trains basically going to zero because people didn't want to be in a crowded bus. They were okay being in a car with 2 other people with a partition. So, I think it gave us an opportunity in Jersey City. And this was a big push of mine, actually. I looked around and I said, look, no one's on the roads. Let's paint the town green literally with bike lanes because no one's driving. No one's going to get mad about closing roads. But also, people are going to want it. And it was exactly true. In May, when the weather started to get warm, people were just out on their bikes, even not going to work, just riding around because they needed to get out of the house. And I think that this holds true in Kansas City too, that it's an if you build it, they will come sort of scenario. People are no doubt looking at the streets around their neighborhoods, and I'm doing it too around where I live, and saying, okay, there's plenty of streets here. I'd love to ride my bike, but I just want to find a safe place to do it. And it's our obligation and responsibility as a city to be doing this as quickly as we can all over the place. A lot of the things that occurred during the pandemic related to transit are not going to swing back totally to the way they were. We have a new equilibrium and a baseline. We're not going to have the same, people are not going to be going to their offices in the same manner and at the same frequency that they were in the past, which is great. It opens up new options for us, and it allows us to reconfigure things and rethink our streets and our street designs and that sort of thing. I think sort of tangential, but not really to Vision Zero here is outdoor dining, where we can certainly quote unquote reclaim some of the sidewalk and street space for different types of uses. And not have to turn back on it. I think it was I'll give you an example from, I know I keep drawing back to Jersey City, but I was there during the height of the pandemic and had a lot of interesting experiences related to Vision Zero, I think are important here. So we had 3 years ago, we had started a pilot with parklets, and we couldn't find 3 or 4 locations where people wanted them. We put them out, the neighborhood would freak out about losing literally 2 parking spaces, and we'd remove it. And we turn around, the pandemic hits, and we couldn't build these things fast enough. We had 80 or so requests in the first 2 months of the spring when we were even allowing outdoor dining in New Jersey. New Jersey was much more strict with the rules, and we couldn't do anything outdoors for a while. But so it puts everything into perspective. It really sort of reset our barometer, as I said before. And now we were thinking communities didn't want these things. Now they couldn't get enough of them. And it's an opportunity here. It's an opportunity everywhere. It's just a good example of that.
Fantastic. Well, that's all very helpful in terms of kind of helping the audience to understand kind of the backdrop that kind of brought you to Kansas City with regards to active transportation. So with that in mind, I kind of want to shift to kind of our next subject area in terms of questions that we have prepared, which is the role of the city manager and kind of what you do overall for the city. So for those in the audience who aren't as familiar, would you take a minute or two to kind of describe your role as a city manager? What is it you do?
Great question. It's a lot of video calls, I'd say. That's my job. But so really my role is to run the day-to-day operation of the city. All of the departments, all of the functions of city government are under my umbrella, so to speak. And it's my job to run and execute the operations that we provide for the city. It's my job also to make sure that we're providing the highest quality and most efficient services for our city, and that we're meeting the needs of all of our residents. If there are other services and types of support that we need to be providing, it's my job to make sure we're pivoting and shifting and focusing on the right things. I would say that the confusing part for people is understanding the relationship between the city manager and the mayor and the council. Mm-hmm. And I think the best way to describe that is sort of that the mayor and council are on a high level dictating policy, And then me and my team as city manager and department directors and the administration were executing on that policy. So the policy can vary as far as specificity. So the mayor and council may say, we want to engage in a Vision Zero campaign. Great. And then it's up to me to just do it, and whatever that means, and set the goals, engage the community, all of the steps that are required to reduce the serious injuries and deaths on our streets. There are also, of course, times where those roles overlap, where council members get involved in some of the details around putting the plans together, and how we're supposed to execute on things, holding us accountable for certain things. And there are times where I get involved in policy creation, of course, in that I can draw from some of my prior experiences and knowledge from how things have worked in other places and some of my network that I have across the country and around the world. So it's sort of a blurry line. I wouldn't say that I am only tasked with executing the policy and council's only tasked with creating that policy. We certainly work together on all that. And I would say that there's nothing that I'm going to do that doesn't have council, at least a conversation with council to understand where we're coming from on things. And I would like to say that the council wouldn't create any policy without talking to me first, but it happens. It is what it is. There are reasons why they will move forward on things without my knowledge, and it's fine. That's the role. So that's sort of how it works. It's hard to create an analogy with the private sector. I would often tell people that I'm sort of like chief operating officer and the mayor's like the CEO, but those are also sort of blurry lines as well.
Right. So one thing that you kind of came in very early on and did that was really encouraging to see was you pushed for the creation of a transportation director within the Department of Public Works. Can you tell us a little bit more about what informed your decision to move in that direction and how most immediately you think that individual can impact other efforts around active transportation in the city?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will say, coming into Kansas City, I knew that Vision Zero was going to be a priority for me and for us. And the question was, how quickly could we execute on that priority? And, of course, there are political reasons why certain things are going to take precedent over others. There are certain more urgent things during the winter, for example, the warming center and the homelessness and the snow plows and that sort of stuff. But also, there's a big planning process related to Vision Zero, and it takes a lot of just dedicated staff and time to think about exactly how we're going to execute on certain things, and literally just drawing up the plans for the streets that we're going to be putting bike lanes in or curb extensions or whatever it is. And the challenge is that a lot of those functions within City Hall and city government overlap a little bit, and it's hard if there's not a point person. It's really hard to manage all this stuff. There are so many projects that are ongoing at any given time. Every bike lane on every segment of street is sort of its own mini project. Every curb extension, every street light study that we're doing, every little thing is its own project, and you need a central point of entry for all that. You need a person managing all that stuff. That being said, we have not started a Department of Transportation just because it's hard to justify that out of the gate to those that make decisions on the budget and the policy around budget. It's easier to say, let's start with a person who's managing it all and then work up from there. Do they need a couple of dedicated staff? Can they work with existing engineers and planners to do certain things in the context of other projects? And that's how we're doing it. And it's been very successful so far as our design, our planning, our vision, and our goal setting for all of this. I anticipate over time that we will add dedicated transportation staff, a transportation planner, maybe a couple of engineers and/or planners that only are doing bike lanes. We have some now, but they're also getting pulled in a couple different directions.
Sure.
And so cities have varying degrees of success with this. I don't think that not having a standalone department is necessarily a signal for more success or not, just because a lot of these projects overlap with other public works things anyway. They overlap with street resurfacing, they overlap with building curbs and ADA ramps and that sort of stuff. So it to me, it makes sense in public works, but everything's iterative in government always, and people make decisions, and, the next city manager is going to make probably different decisions, and hopefully things will just continue as and progress. But yeah, that's sort of the logic behind it.
Okay. And so one of the position that you created under your tenure is a push for a new chief equity officer for the city. So Kansas City recently got some national attention because of our efforts to decriminalize walking and biking. In your view, how do you believe such a role can help to address these historic inequities in aspects of active transportation, not just with regards to over policing, but also with regards to investment?
That's a great question. And the chief equity officer position, same rationale with respect to transportation director, in that you need a point person, you need a single point of entry, you need someone whose experience every day is managing this type of thing. And I'll also say that I personally don't know the extent of all of the equity challenges across the city. I don't think anyone does, unless you're going to be a chief equity officer. And those types of challenges are the obvious things like racism and discrimination, but there are less obvious things. And one example that I like to talk about is I did with Variety KC, I did a wheelchair challenge, they called it, where you basically ride a wheelchair around and get the experience of being in that position. And, and I did this in Jersey City too, and it was terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying to ride a wheelchair on a city street with parked cars, trying to roll into an intersection and think and feel safe in that scenario. And it's the same here. You're at eye level with the headlights. And by the way, what feels very smooth and comfortable with your feet is not in a wheelchair. And that is something that we have to think about. An example that really opened my eyes into equity. Maybe our streets and sidewalks are fine for people who are able-bodied with 2 feet, but once you get into a wheelchair, there's a big challenge there. And that's probably why you don't see a lot of people in wheelchairs on our sidewalks. I've seen people in wheelchairs more in the middle of the street, in motorized wheelchairs, than on the sidewalks or even in the bike lanes. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's not safe, it's not comfortable, you just can't do it. The chief equity officer position originally was just sort of a broad, overarching, like, let's look at all of the issues related to equity across the city. There are, of course, the day before I started this role was the day the KC Star released their report on racism and discrimination in the fire department. So that was the initial motivation for that role.
Right.
But you're right, like there are so many other things that I don't even know and that we don't know are equity issues across the city. And that's why it's crucial to have a person dedicated to dealing with all of those things.
Sure. Yeah, and it's very encouraging to kind of see kind of how the role will help to shape policy moving forward, not just with transportation, but as you said, with issues around the fire department and elsewhere. So we're going to move into one more section of questioning before we get to the audience questions. So before we do that, I do want to encourage everyone again, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will do our best to get through as many of them as we can before our time is up. So, so the last kind of section of questions that we kind of had prepared to discuss with you today was around your broader vision for active transportation here in KCMO. And so let's start by taking the 30,000 foot view here. What is Brian Platt's vision for improving active transportation in KCMO?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll preface it by saying that I firmly believe that while I may have a lot of personal views and opinions on things, I really do try to incorporate the sentiment of the communities across the city in these types of things. So I may think that on a very basic level, a bike lane should go here, we should do this that way. But if communities are, and the Vision Zero Task Force and all the stakeholders are saying a different thing, then that's how it's going to go, if we can make it work. And so I'll say it that way first. But I would say also that generally, we have a really big opportunity in Kansas City because of how much underutilized land and unused land we have across the city. Look outside of my windows at City Hall, and I'm in the middle of downtown Kansas City, and there are skyscrapers everywhere. I'm in one of them, and I look down, and there are just surface parking lots. There is just grass, literally just grass, just grass areas around City Hall. And that's an opportunity. I see it as a big opportunity to do all types of things, to build not just housing, but affordable housing, not just affordable housing, but other types of community benefits and givebacks. It could be schools, it could be libraries, it could be urgent care, it could be retail, it could be social service, it could be all these things that we hopefully can do with all this vacant land. It also presents a big opportunity to create a more walkable and bikeable core of the city. I don't think that, people like, it's great to think about how we can paint this city green and bike lanes all over the place, but you're probably not going to get a lot of people who are biking from one end to the other on a given day.
Mhm.
That happens in Jersey City because it's not that long of an area, and it's pretty logical where people are going to and coming from. But I think we have an opportunity to focus a lot of that in the urban core in downtown Kansas City, building around the streetcar, building around some new high-rise development, making an environment that could be less car dependent. I'm not saying that I know maybe some of us like the idea of banning cars, but maybe making it so you don't need a car for everything. You can have one if you want one. You can use it, you can get around fine, but maybe it's going to be easier to do things walking or biking, and maybe it's going to be just as easy and just as comfortable and convenient to do it that way. It also unlocks more affordable transit options for people. It's, of course, much more expensive to own and operate a car than it is to walk or bike. But right now, it is limiting in the fact that there are only certain areas of the city where you could get by reasonably just on a bike, or just walking. And that, I think, is a big opportunity to fill in some of these vacant pieces of property, make it so you can live in an urban area and not need a car and be able to walk around the stuff and have active, vibrant streetscapes and that sort of thing. I'm a big Jane Jacobs fan as well. And I'm really she writes a lot of really interesting things about how, if you want to activate your streets and create like these vibrant neighborhoods and walkable areas, you just have to have like a lot of different types of people and a lot of different types of stuff. It's building a lot of stuff. And you just need a lot of it too. So that I think is I would say the general premise of where I'm coming from with all this. Like, if we can build a lot more things and put a lot more people downtown, we can make an environment that allows for that sort of thing.
So kind of within that, and that idea of kind of creating kind of walkable, bikeable portions of the city, even though there are kind of these kind of subsets of areas like Midtown, the historic Northeast, the Swope Park area, they are still somewhat connected by kind of existing arterials and transit lines. And one kind of persistent problem has been a lack of east-west connections on important corridors for things like bus rapid transit and protected bike facilities. So I know that there is that drive to want to create walkable areas within each of these neighborhoods. But I also am curious to hear more about what plans you may have to address that lack of connection between those key neighborhoods.
Yeah, that is going to be a big challenge. It's going to take us a while to do. And, you can look at a map and look at the street geometry and think about, where to put a streetcar extension. I am super supportive of east-west connections to the streetcar. Already having conversations about it since like the second week I got here. And I think that sort of thing is going to be important. But, we also have buses and we also have, we've had some conversations, of course, here about sort of doing a VIA type initiative that I did in Jersey City here, shuttle on demand, sort of shared ride share kind of thing here too. Opening up all those types of transit are important, but you have to have the right facilities for it, safe facilities as well. So when we look at our bike lane network, of course, for example, that's going to be something we're going to need to think about east-west. And I think there's a lot of potential opportunity because there are so many lanes, so many extra travel lanes across the city. You look at pretty much from the river to, you go as far south as you can. I think every east-west road has probably an extra lane at least. And they're not filled with parked cars, so you could put very large, wide cycle facilities, bike facilities along those corridors and really close some of the gap. And because of the distances that would need to be traveled in some neighborhoods, you're probably looking at more scooters. You're probably looking at more electric bikes or that kind of thing, bike share. I mean, I'm not sure what the answer is going to be, but streetcar is going to help. Other types of transit are going to help that as well. I also think that one of the reasons why we're talking so much about connecting these faraway neighborhoods is because not every neighborhood has everything they need close by, and you have to go these far distances. And that speaks back to the point about just filling in some of those vacant pieces of land. If you have, a pharmacy and a clothing store and a grocery store and all the things you need within a few blocks, you don't need to think about having to go 20 blocks south to get to the CVS, which is the case in my neighborhood. I'm over in the 3rd district, and as much as I love walking around over there, I have to get in a car a lot of times if like my 3-year-old needs something. There's really not a lot that's walkable over there, and it's a far distance, and it would be great to have some more stuff in the neighborhood. But you don't get there without filling in some of those just pieces, literally plots of grass in the neighborhood. And it's not just the 3rd district. It's all the districts. There's an opportunity for this everywhere.
Sure. And so kind of taking it back and kind of thinking a little bit more broadly again, what are some of the other ways that you hope to elevate the need to kind of support and invest in active transportation here in Kansas City?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have to demonstrate the value and the impact of things like the streetcar. We have to be able to point to increasing numbers of people who are utilizing alternative means of transit. We have to demonstrate the success of all these things, the number of rides on the streetcar, rides on the bus, scooter rides. All those things are important because it paints the picture of how, look, I'm one of the biggest, most progressive transit people out there. I'm still in my car a lot just because I'm driving around the city doing work stuff all day. And I don't see a lot of people on bikes or scooters or on the bus, but that doesn't mean they're not doing it. It just means that on the road I'm driving on, I'm not seeing it. And because, they're not on 71 and I'm on 71 a lot for whatever reason. So, but I think it's important to point to those things. It's important to point to other demographic data about how many cars per household we have and in what neighborhoods those numbers are higher and lower, and economic levels of our residents. In the lowest income areas, it's more than likely that car ownership is lower, and transit, people are more reliant on transit. So we can also, I think, point to other cities as examples of this, of how transit is an economic tool for people, how our free buses and our free streetcar can be an economic tool for not just development, but for people to make sure that they have access to jobs and healthcare and all of the things, the basic necessities that people need in a literally free manner for people. So there's a huge benefit and value to transit out there. We just have to point to the right numbers and make sure that we're being prudent in our discussions there. We all know that I don't think it's been that much of a pushback here, but there is a significant pro-car, pro-parking lobby that exists, particularly in urban areas in the Northeast. And you just have to be ready for those things. You don't always have a full set of council members that understand the data and the value for all of this. And that educational component is incredibly important in the beginning, at least.
Sure. Well, thank you again for starting off by answering all of these questions. It's been very informative up to this point, and I'm sure it will continue to be. So, so what we're going to do now is we're going to switch gears just a little bit and shift to the audience questions. So there were a number of you who registered beforehand and submitted some questions. So we're going to answer a few of those. And then again, if you have questions that you've been thinking of, feel free to drop them in the chat. And we will do our best to try to get through as many of them as we can. So Brian, the first question I kind of wanted to ask you from our audience is kind of related to this theme of connectivity. We had several people who were asking about, bike lane projects extending and going this place and this place. And so one kind of overarching question to kind of speak to that theme is, how will city staff work to incorporate connectivity into project considerations over the long term?
That's a great question. And there's two competing desires here, I'd say, from our team. One is, at first, we really do want to move quickly and build out as much as we can as quickly as we can. That means going after the lowest hanging fruit, the widest streets with the least number of conflicts, and the places that we can just throw a bike lane on as quickly as we can at a very high level. We're resurfacing a street, no one's going to complain about it, just throw it in there. On the other side of it, that doesn't create a network that is very usable for people if, for example, you just have like parallel bike lanes or they're all just all over the place. So we do want to start to build a network out at first as well. So those are the two competing interests that we have at this point. And I would also say there's an equity component too, which really is a third one. We don't want to just only do these types of things in certain neighborhoods. But on the other side of that one, there are certain neighborhoods where this is going to be a much more popular type of initiative, and there are more people that have bikes and are interested in this sort of thing. So there are a lot of sort of things that we have to take into consideration here. But that being said, we're trying to balance adding new protected bike. I'm just talking about really protected bike lanes at this point, but we're trying to add them in all of the wards at the same time, while also going after the lowest hanging fruit and also going after neighborhoods that are most supportive of these things. We do want to take the approach of, if you build it, they will come, but we don't want to build it and have literally no one use it, and then everyone point to an unused bike lane and then complain about wasted dollars, and have another neighborhood where we have hundreds or thousands of people on their bikes just looking for a place to ride safely and not be able to do it there. So there's a lot of push and pull, I'd say, in these conversations. So you may see some sort of bike lanes to nowhere kind of thing, especially over the next couple of months as we start to build things out. But I will say that we took the same approach in Jersey City, and it was phenomenally successful, because the worst thing that can be done is trying to force bike lanes into areas where there's a lot of resistance at first, in the name of trying to build a network or trying to be equitable, and having so much pushback that there's just the no's drown out the yeses. It's really important to build a lot of this stuff and to have it be successful, even with lower ridership. And then when you're trying to fill in the gaps of the puzzle and connect all of the nodes, so to speak, that then if there's a conflict or if there's going to be pushback, you can point to a network that's already there, and this is just closing that gap. And you can point to places where people are already riding them. People are already starting to think about these things. They're seeing them, they're more visible. They're thinking more about riding a bike. And now that the gap is closed, now they know that they can go from wherever it is, Westport to City Hall, on a totally protected bike lane network every day, any day, that sort of thing. So yeah, there are some competing interests there. Equity is a big component of it, but making sure that everything we do has the least amount of resistance at first is also really important.
Sure. And so another kind of overarching theme with the questions that we received from the audience beforehand was about safety. So an additional thing I wanted to make sure I asked about is, it's great to hear about the protected bike lanes, and we're certainly excited to see more of those. But what are some of the additional measures that you envision for ensuring the safety of vulnerable road users, be they pedestrians, disabled users, or transit riders?
Great question, and it's my fault as well that Vision Zero discussions often focus on bike lanes mostly. There are so many other things that we can and have been doing and will continue to do as far as improving safety for all road users. Intersections, of course, are the locations at which there are the most of the crashes and interactions between the different types of road users. And so those are the places that we're prioritizing as well. Those types of interventions and intersections can vary. And one of the things that we're going to do is, instead of saying, do you want a curb extension here, or do you want a stop sign here, we're asking people, tell us where there are unsafe locations, and we will come out and evaluate. Because, oftentimes people, for whatever reason, want a certain thing, but it may not be the best use of those things. And there may be other implementations that we can do. But I'll go through some of the things I think we're going to focus on mostly. Curb extensions, of course, narrowing the distance between sidewalks and the area of street that a person or a cyclist or whoever has to walk across the street and interact with cars. Also, curb extensions, of course, make it a little harder to drive quickly around turns. Traffic signals, we're looking at reprogramming some of our traffic signals to add LPIs, leading pedestrian indicators, or intervals that in a very high level, instead of getting the walk signal across the street while there's also cars driving on that street, all of the signals are red for cars. Pedestrians get a little bit of a head start. They get a little bit of lead time into the intersection. Most of the crashes with pedestrians actually occur right at the curb line or very close to it. So letting people get off the curb a little bit makes them a little more visible, and it's hopefully a little safer in that sense. Speed humps, of course, are things that maybe not in an intersection, but hopefully are going to slow people down on some of the more neighborhood types of streets. And there's some other technology that we can use as far as detectors and cameras and that sort of stuff as well. I think that there are some broader citywide policies as well about enforcement. Of course, enforcement is always part of the discussion, but enforcement is not sort of on its own going to solve any issues, because of course, if there's a police officer on a corner, you might slow down, but once that police officer's gone, you're back to doing whatever you were doing. We do need to keep people accountable, of course, but that's one component of it. Citywide speed limits, of course, narrowing some of the travel lanes across the city to make it a little more uncomfortable for cars to drive so fast, changing the street geometry in general to make it so we get rid of some of the, racetracks and drag strips that we have across the city. There are, as I said before, just a lot of extra street width across the city that makes it just so easy to drive fast. Like I find myself sometimes just driving on Oak Street and I'm like, I'm going way too fast right now just because there are no cars and there's nothing near me to give that visual impression that I'm going too fast.
Right.
Bike lanes come into that conversation as well. If you put a parking protected bike lane in and suddenly there's a parked car that's only a few feet from the edge of your car, of course you're going to drive a little slower just because it's harder to drive down that street. So the bike lanes do play into this quite a bit, and the bike lanes also lead to more of a streetscape redesign. We're really reconfiguring the street in a lot of ways. Using parked cars as a barrier can be really helpful as well. But there's some other interventions as well that we're certainly going to be working through.
Sure. One other quick audience submitted question beforehand that we got that I wanted to make sure I asked about is, what do you think of using parking policy as a way to incentivize more walking, biking, and use of transit?
Yeah, great question. So we've already started to have these discussions about reducing the parking that's being built in new developments and changing. I just reread Donald Shoup's High Cost of Free Parking over the last, well, it took me a while because it's so long. He repeats himself a lot, but you get the gist of it. But yeah, I think that parking is very convenient and easy in Kansas City, and that's great. It's great for accessibility and for getting around. But there are things that we can do to make other types of transit more convenient, use parking infrastructure to the benefit of other types of transit. And also, you don't want to say make it really hard to drive a car or own a car, but sort of right size the costs of owning a car versus owning a bike. So parking can, the fact that you can drive around the city and do stuff in park places and it just all for free all the time doesn't really make a lot of sense. That we should be thinking about changing different parking rates, moving parking to certain areas, encouraging off-street parking, encouraging on-street parking, but also making sure that we're changing the rates so it can be maybe a little more expensive on street, pushing people to off-street parking, but also reducing the amount of parking that we're building in these new developments and
Right.
encouraging more transit-oriented development. That's, I think, the main part of this, that, we're trying to say to these new developments, instead of building 1.5 parking spaces or 2 parking spaces for every apartment in your building, make it 1 or less for now. I don't think we're quite at like a 0.5 in a lot of places, but just reducing those numbers. We'll get there over time. And while you're reducing those numbers, theoretically, you're building less parking infrastructure in your development, and theoretically, your development costs less now. But while you're doing that, build more transit-oriented elements into that plan. Build, maybe put in car share, so not everyone has to own a car, and on the few days you need it, you can, rent the Tesla that's parked in the parking lot, something like that. Build bike parking facilities. Build bike infrastructure around the development itself. Make sure that you're building it ground floor retail as well. That's part of it. It really it's interesting to talk about it this way, but if you're building stuff that people need in the building itself, they're not going to need to travel as much, and therefore they're not going to need to get in a car as much. And in Jersey City, I had this experience, and it was fantastic. And one of the last buildings I lived in, it was right on we call it the light rail. It was basically the streetcar. But in the building, there was a gym, there was a grocery store, there was a hair salon, there was actually a school, but it was more of an after school kind of thing. And so, like, there were days where, if I was working from home, I wasn't, but people were, you wouldn't really have to leave the block to do all the things you needed to do. Across the street was a burger place. So, that means I'm not getting in a car or having to drive anywhere to do the things that I need to do. And so there's less dependency on car, and that helps. A lot of developments with ground floor retail, with less parking needs, with more transit-oriented development will help sort of, and that's all parking policy. It'll help us sort of push people into alternative means of transit.
Sure. And kind of with that idea of expanding transit and everything, there was a question in the chat from our friend Andy in Topeka. Do you see a need or future for regional transit from Kansas City to Northwest Missouri or Northeast Kansas, whether that's buses, light rail, or a combo of the two?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that when you're thinking about building the other types of transit infrastructure beyond bike lanes, which are very cheap to build, you really do have to think critically about where people are going, where they're coming from. And in a place like this, you're really thinking about a central node, like a spoke and hub kind of thing. So the center of downtown is the hub, and you're sending transit out in different directions. And the streetcar is sort of like that beginning, the first spine, those first 2 spokes, I guess, if you can think about it that way. And then we got to start thinking about other directions to head. Are we sending a streetcar, east on Linwood out to Arrowhead? Are we sending a streetcar west? I know this is going to spark a lot of controversy, but like west down, like Southwest Trafficway out into KCK and then Overland Park, and those are all fantastic ideas. It allows people in other neighborhoods to be less dependent on cars and to have other options for them. It's a different kind of lifestyle. And yes, absolutely. Will we get to Topeka by, the next election? Probably not. No offense. But, I think, the streetcar took however many years it took to get to where we are, and we haven't even built out this first leg of it. So it's a long process. I wish we could accelerate it, but it's just going to take a while to get to that sort of thing.
Sure. So another question that we had here was going back to your point about noticing the overbuilt streets. Can the city do a study into which streets are overbuilt and can have lanes removed so we can have a better idea of where there might be space for reclaimed wider sidewalks, bike lanes, or parklets?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually say we may not even need a citywide study. I think it's just like very obvious in a lot of places that we could look at this. And the challenge there is, well, what do you do after that study or after we've identified a street? It's very expensive to build a concrete sidewalk out another lane into the street. Our approach is going to be, will continue to be for now, is to use paint and plastic, use cheap interventions to prove the model and to do it sort of on a pilot approach where let's put a bike lane in with paint. And look, in Jersey City, every single bike lane we put in inevitably had an issue with it. We had to come out, grind it out, change something. People complained that it was actually, you know, on paper it looks one way, you put it on the street and it doesn't make any sense anymore. And that's going to happen here too. It absolutely will. And so I think rather than make things like that permanent right away, let's start to do cheaper implementations. And for example, like let people build wooden parklets in the street or in parking spaces, and then go from there and then make it permanent later. Pennsylvania Ave in Westport is a good example of this, where we spent very little money and just put up some barricades. And now we can measure the success of it rather than just saying, let's close this down and put pavers out or do other really expensive treatments. Let's make sure this works first. So yeah, but I think I think we don't even need a study for a lot of this just because it's so obvious in a lot of places that there's a need for it. But then the question is, you know, where do we prioritize? What segments of street are important to do first? And how much do we want to spend? How far do we want to go with it all at one time?
Excellent. So the last question before I turn it back over to Liz, it comes from Ryan Mott. Are you open to or looking at any permanent car-free streets? He gives the example of dedicating 39th Street to east-west streetcar transit and bike.
Yeah, absolutely. But I would say that we need to have a lot of conversations about that first. I had a really successful project, one of my favorite projects in Jersey City, it's now like probably almost half a mile of a street into a pedestrian plaza. It's probably a little less than half a mile, but actually maybe it's more like, it doesn't matter. In a very dense area with a lot of cars driving through it. And, you know, there are plenty of streets that we could close and traffic would flow around it. The question is, we got to make sure that the street will have a new activity and use that we can point to and justify it. It's fine to say like, look, there's too many lanes on 27th Street. But if you close 27th Street, there's nothing around it in parts, and it would like have no action and activity. And then every critic will point to this and say the city wasted all this money closing a street down for nothing, for nobody. No one's using it. So I think if we could find an area, I would love to, yes, to find areas that would have better uses than what they are now. And even if that's just closing down a couple of lanes like we were talking about earlier, that's fine too. I think that there's no single right answer to some of this. It's really just supporting the neighborhoods in that area and making sure that if we're doing it, it's for a reason that's going to be very positive for the most amount of people.
Sure. All right. Well, again, thank you for those questions from the audience. I'm going to turn it back over to Liz to take us out of here.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Michael. This was a really great conversation. I enjoyed listening, and I'm sure that everyone else did too. So as I said before, this session has been recorded. I will follow up later this week with an email to everyone who registered that will include the link to the recording as well as some other things. I want to thank everyone who came today. I want to thank especially our BikeWalkKC members for making this series possible. If you are a member of BikeWalkKC, you are keeping us afloat right now, and you are certainly making big change, real change in our region. And I think that you can see that from a lot of the news that we've had coming around lately. If you are a member of our advocacy newsletter, you'll be getting an update very soon because we have another event coming up, I believe next week, Michael, am I right? The PIAC. So that is coming up very soon. We're having a training session, a little workshop, a virtual workshop around PIAC, which is the Public Improvements Advisory Committee. Did I get that right, Michael?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Public Improvements Advisory Committee. And that's a KCMO thing. And the Public Improvements Advisory Committee helps folks fund and implement public improvements in their neighborhood. So that could be things like in your neighborhood park or an intersection near your home. We will be hosting a workshop on that at the beginning of June. So stay tuned. I'll send out more of that information in that follow-up email today or tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you to those who gave a donation. The donations will go to our LCI scholarships. That's the League Cycling Instructor Scholarships for people from underrepresented communities. So that's Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, and folks in the LGBTQ community. We'll be giving out those scholarships to invite people to come become leaders in the biking scene here in Kansas City. So I especially appreciate those of you who gave to that fundraiser, and there are still more opportunities to give to that fundraiser. So thank you so much, all of you, for coming today. Thank you for participating and enjoying this conversation between Brian and Michael today. And have a good afternoon. We will see you next time, next week, I hope. Thank you, everyone.